Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space for a flash class on the possible futures of human space exploration. Join noted astronomer, author, and science communicator Chris Impey for a 30-minute flash class as he draws on his extensive knowledge and unique perspective to discuss the possibilities as well as the obstacles facing humans as we leave the planet to live and work in space. Chris Impey is the Distinguished Professor of Astronomy at the University of Arizona and has written a range of books on the topic of human space exploration and astrobiology, including Beyond, Our Future in Space, and his forthcoming book, Worlds Without End, Exoplanets, Habitability, and the Future of Humanity. Our moderator today is Chris Kimmel, the founder of Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of Space Tango.
Good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space. Welcome to this flash class. We're really pleased to have our special guest today, Chris Impey, which I'll introduce in just a second. But before that, I want to thank our sponsors who make this all possible. Space 629, KSTC, Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, the National Stem Cell Foundation, the Shelgren Center, Baird Financial, Space Tango, the START program, and Higher Orbits Media Collaboratory, and 22 Solutions, as well as the Virtual Solar System Institute at NASA, at Ames Research Center. So again, to thank all of those people. It's really my pleasure that we've been able to get Chris for our webinar today. Chris is an amazing thinker. He's the author of a number of books on space, astrobiology, you name it. I've had the pleasure of reading a couple of his books before, and in preparation for this, went online and looked at a lot of his interviews, which are really special. And I encourage you, next time you're wanting to binge watch something, instead of watching your computer or one of your programs, you go online to his website and view some of his interviews, because they're really excellent. So let me start off by just asking Chris, if he doesn't mind, to say a few words about himself. I'll let him introduce himself, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Good to be with you, Chris, and the audience today. So short potted summary of me. I'm you won't tell from the accent, but I was born in Scotland. I'm a Brit. I'm born in Edinburgh and schooled across transatlantic college in London, and then Ph.D. in Edinburgh, and then emigrated, since most people who've been to Britain notice there are not a lot of stars there. So to be an astronomer, you have to go west, young man. And I went west to Hawaii, then to Caltech, both postdocs, and I've been at University of Arizona since 1986 on the faculty. And my research is primarily observational cosmology, distant galaxies and their supermassive black holes. But I have strong interest in astrobiology and the space program and our future in space and so on. And I like teaching and doing outreach, so I try and mix it up. Faculty have a lot of intellectual freedom to work on different things. As long as we meet our teaching assignments and bring in money and keep the boss happy, we can pretty much do what we want. So I enjoy that freedom. And I'm pleased to be with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. You've written across the spectrum of ideas and information. So, but I want to focus a little bit, and again, I encourage the audience to go to Chris's website and look at his books, and you can certainly get a sense of his vast array of knowledge. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about today about some of your thoughts on the future of space. Humanity in Deep Space is an initiative really which is focusing on focuses on how we as humans are going to maintain our humanity and our humanness as we venture into deep space, which is certainly above the 250 miles of space station. And for our purposes, we include the moon, but even more than that, looking at beyond that as well. And I was really interested in some of your thoughts, and I really also was interested and appreciated in one of your interviews. You went back and you kind of started at the beginning of human migration and talked about how some of this desire for exploration may be in our genes, et cetera. I want you to start with just talking a little bit about that.
Right. So exploration is essentially built into us as humans because there are other species, obviously, that migrate large distances across the planet, whales, birds, and so on. But they do so for food sources or for mating and then giving birth in different parts of the world. Humans are the only species that had moved historically across the planet when they didn't actually need to. And it took them through some very inhospitable regions. So we radiated across the planet mostly from Africa, obviously originally across Asia, and then over the land bridge to the Americas, and covered enormous amounts of ground. And again, very simple, primitive hunter-gatherers in small groups with a lot of physical adversity. And so it seems like adventure and exploration are built into us, and curiosity. And so once we sort of did that in the planet, then doing it into space is another natural projection. But it's a vastly more austere and forbidding environment, because even though humans lived on the edge of the ice pack in the ice ages, and that amazes many people when they realize where we lived on the Earth during the last ice age, living in space is much more intimidating proposition.
So we wonder, we talk a lot about, when we talk about deep space, we talk about even the moon. A lot of times, I think we jump forward and we talk about, outpost on Mars, and we see all these, images and drawings of those kinds of things, and even on the moon. But one of the things that we certainly look at a lot at Humanity in Deep Space is I'll call it the kind of the first 25 to 50 years. When we don't have everything figured out. What is you talk a lot about, I know a lot about the technology and stuff, but what is your sense of, I know in one of your videos too, you talk about that, as humans, if we do move on to Mars, obviously it won't be the same structurally that we are on Earth. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, and just your sense of, is it, in your view, is that going to be possibly a deal breaker initially? I know we did a webinar last year with some people from Harvard Harvard Medical School, and also Chris Mason, who was one of the twin study leads. And we talked about, are we built for space? And one of the things they talked about was some doubts as to whether humans in the early stages are going to be able to actually do this for any length of time without some sort of genetic engineering.
That's a good question, but I think actually engineering is going to be in the mix very early. So one thing I think is a premise, and it's pretty clear from the kind of people who will self-select to take this kind of adventure off Earth, is these are very technology forward people. So they will be adapting and adopting technologies that are sort of bleeding edge for us. And that includes genetic engineering, self-engineering, or hacking your own genome. And so these things, which sound slightly science fictional, they're sort of already emerging as technologies on the Earth, where there are ethical issues and regulatory issues. But of course, in space, there are no regulatory constraints. So it's a wild west up there. So for that reason, plus the sort of technology forward nature of the people who do this, I think they will be using those methods to help adapt to this difficult situation. They'll be adjusting their own physiology and their own, at some level, their own genome and their genetics. And certainly when it's a multi-generational situation, you'll see very rapid adaptation, far more rapid than occurs on the Earth. So I think that's going to be built in right from the beginning.
And how long do you think that might, obviously we've got companies and others talking about, putting humans in, trying to put humans on Mars in the next, 10 years, whatever. How do you think those people will fare? Because that's obviously not going to be able to, a lot of that's not going to happen before we theoretically put our first people into space to go to Mars.
Right. So I think the first people doing this are going to be, of course, assuming an enormous risk, and they will be well aware of the risk, and some may not survive the experience. And our first ventures off Earth will, of course, they're temporary. It's going to take quite a lot of work and an enormous amount of effort and money to develop a self-sustaining, modest foothold on Mars, say. So that's not going to happen really for decades, to be realistic. Yeah. So the first visitors are going to be temporary visitors, and they will assume a large risk. They'll obviously suffer several times the lifetime radiation dose on Earth just getting to Mars and then coming back. So, but I think in the end, that's a minor incremental risk compared to the fundamental risk of these missions failing and just people not surviving the journey.
Right. Also, those of you who have questions, please use our chat. Via chat, you can ask questions of Chris, and we'll start to integrate some of those in. So please feel free to do that. I see some coming in already. Chris, you also, I know you talked about, this is an issue that I know we've dealt a lot with or had a lot of conversations. This idea that, there's not a lot of regulations in space, and some of the ethical issues and that may arise, particularly now with we live in a very, obviously, human nature being what it is. The human experience our history has been very contentious and things of that nature. And so, what's your sense of a little bit more about? Yes, there are no laws and regulations really in place for deep space.
Well, I mean, I think it's a bit of a problem. It's an issue because the UN, the only regulatory body that has ever had any treaties on space, Outer Space Treaty 65, Moon Treaty 79, and that's about all, except for a couple of working groups. In principle, we could get some regulatory framework from the UN if enough countries signed on to it, which is a big caveat.
Right.
But there's no sign of it happening anytime soon. And the international nor the national regulatory bodies, they're simply not keeping up with the pace that this is happening. And also the American government, in a very deliberate way over the last few decades, has pretty much taken a hands-off approach as far as perhaps for the good reason of not wanting to smother this young activity of the commercial space program. But the flip side of that, of course, is that it could well be underregulated. And much off Earth, issues of ownership are completely unresolved, and it's sort of a Wild West in that way, in terms of how people are treated, human rights, workers' rights, all the things we talk about and think we've largely resolved, or at least have in view on the Earth, will have to be invented out of whole cloth in space, because there's no governing body, there's no framework, there's no set of rules that are in place for everyone that anyone has to follow.
One of the questions came in. It talks about a lot of science fiction written about humans on Mars, and somebody asked the question: how do you think that any of those pictures that have been painted by in the past are likely to be something we'll actually see?
There's so much Mars science fiction, starting with Ray Bradbury. So you've got 70 or 80 years of Mars science fiction, actually more than that. And I love a lot of it. And probably the more recent, it's not that recent, but the Blue Green Mars trilogy of Kim Stanley Robinson is sort of my favorite set of books that kind of lay out a future where Mars is being terraformed and lays out the sort of social and political aspect too, of how the colonists will feel and how their autonomy from the Earth will become an issue, and how they'll view the resources there and the tensions that will arise, because they won't all be it won't be a monolith. There'll be different groups of colonists. So that's a set of books I really like. And I don't know if he's captured the way it will actually be in 100 years, but it feels right. It feels close. And also it feels like he's paid attention again to these more cultural and social and political issues, which hard science fiction sometimes neglects.
I want to talk, in the early part of us going onto Mars as humans, there's a lot of issues dealing with, our ability as humans to cope with a lot of these things. One being both physiologically, but also the psychological aspect of the isolation. As you know better than anyone. I mean, a trip to Mars is 5.5, 6 months. So you're going to be up even I'm talking about for the early missions. What are your thoughts on that?
I think these are huge issues, and they tend to be sort of underestimated by the visionaries. I mean, the Elon Musks of the world. Okay, he's a particular person because he's accomplished some amazing things, but he also projects futures that probably are unattainable. But it's certainly the case that the psychological and social aspects living off Earth for any extended period are extreme. We only have very weak analogies on the Earth, such as people who winter over in Antarctica and so on. And there are various examples of people who've lived in isolation in small groups. And it doesn't always go well. I mean, just up the road from me was the biosphere, and that was just 6 people
Right.
trying to survive for 2 years. And it didn't go well in terms of their self-contained survival, and it didn't go well socially, and it was a bit of a disaster all around. So we don't have very good models or analogies that we're playing out on Earth. And the level of disconnection, the level of isolation is something completely different. I mean, that's where the moon and Mars should never be put in the same,
Right.
because they're so different in terms of what's implied for people living in those locations.
Yeah, I think one of the big differences too is you said they're not, shouldn't be put in the same box. Is going to Mars is, aside from the extended zero-G exposure and problems and issues, it's also you're looking at humans being completely separated from nature. And people say, well, the moon, but you can see the Earth from the moon. You can look out the ISS and say, well, there's Chicago. And I think that's another one of the things that may be overlooked, is how we as humans, having evolved through that from the beginning of time in terms of life, how we're going to, how that might affect us.
I guess the counter argument, though, just to play both sides here, is that we're already doing that. I mean, modern city dwelling humans are already incredibly isolated from nature. Many of them
Right.
do not experience it. Humans are already spending most of their time in enclosed environments and artificial light, playing video games in virtual worlds. And so we are by choice adopting many of the attributes of a lifestyle that would be forced on you if you lived on Mars. Then you don't have an option. You can't just walk to the park,
right,
get a breath of fresh air. So the extra stress of that is real, I'm sure. But you just could argue that we're heading in this direction. And so the people, again, the first people who go there are probably going to be very in tune with inhabiting virtual environments or getting their sustenance intellectually from visual stimuli that don't involve trees
right.
and blue sky. And so maybe it'll work. I don't know. The social dynamics are also very hard to play out, because the kind of people, the sort of psychological profile of people who would be willing to go to Mars and are going to be selected to go to Mars, nobody really knows how to do that. Obviously, the historical example of the astronauts, the US astronauts through Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, are not good examples, because that was such a monoculture of people,
Right.
mostly white guys from the Midwest and test pilots and military people. So you're going to have a bigger diversity of human experience and jobs and skill sets to be on Mars in any reasonable way. So we don't have an example from history or a model on the Earth for this.
Right.
It's pretty uncharted territory.
You've also talked, and I thought it was interesting, about some of the commercial aspects of space and some of the other kinds of technologies that are emerging. I had the opportunity to interview last couple of months ago Story Musgrave, the astronaut who repaired the Hubble telescope, among other many things. And we were talking about this and the costs involved. And he was very optimistic about some of the technological abilities and accomplishments. But one of the big questions is who's going to pay for all this? And as you indicated in something I saw, is there really isn't much of a commercial market for much going on in space at this point.
No, and even though the budding commercial sector is doing very well, led by SpaceX and Blue Origins, those two billionaires, until Musk took a tank on his on his Twitter adventure, they were the two richest people on the planet, and they've been basically putting $1 billion plus of their own capital into this for years now, just to keep it afloat. Musk has contracts with NASA, of course, that are quite significant. So I think that's just part of the projection of this, that the initial players may not survive. I mean, who remembers the first internet service providers? Nobody, because they don't exist anymore. They went out of business, even though the internet is a multi-trillion-dollar economy now. So the first space companies may go out of business too, and they will lose a lot of money. People will lose their shirts, and the paying proposition of commercial activity in space is still a ways off, except for launching satellites. That's the sort of bread and butter, the meat and potatoes, which is always
Right, right. Now, you also mentioned, well, one of the questions that's come into is expressed some fears of the militarization of space, and that once we leave the planet, last year we had one of our webcasts. We had Admiral Thomas, who was a Navy nuclear subcaptain, and who they go underwater. So it's some really interesting analogs there. But he made the comment that so from a military standpoint, space is the ultimate high ground. And now you've also talked a little bit about that.
right. It's clear that we are engaged in a superpower rivalry with China, and one part of that is playing out in space, because the Chinese have an incredibly ambitious space program. Also, their space program is growing rate of their economy. Okay, that took a notch down this year, but historically that's been a doubling of their budget for the space activity every 5 years compared to NASA's stagnant budget over decades in real terms. And their average aerospace or space employee is 28, 29, 30. NASA about retirement age. So they're young, they're dynamic, they're putting a lot of money in, and their space activity is merged in a military industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know all of their plans. I mean, sure, the intelligence we have that we can't read about is pretty good, so there's no huge surprises. And if people really started putting nukes in space, we have sufficient surveillance and imaging that we would know about it. But it's still a concern, because the Outer Space Treaty, that was 1965, that banned weapons in space in principle, was signed by pretty much everyone. Would there be backsliding on that? There could be, because it is a frontier of warfare. It's a very logical next frontier of warfare. And so I think that's a concern. And then when you move off Earth, of course, then the rules go away entirely. So, we're only talking about the near Earth environment where there seems to be some regulation from a UN treaty.
Yeah, there was an interesting article that I saw a year ago or so. The title of the article is, "Can we own Mars?" And it approached the question of, can we, in a sense, as we reach Mars, whether it's commercially or whatever, actually claim ownership of part of the planet?
You can claim anything. Private individuals can. The Moon Treaty supposedly addressed some of the issues of ownership, but only by governments, not by commercial entities or private individuals. And we're talking about, private individuals and companies going and doing this activity. So they can set down a stake and claim the mining rights or whatever it is if they want. A company, and there's enough private individuals interested in going back to the moon, they could sort of set up a perimeter around one of the Apollo landing sites and charge people to look at it or whatever, or trample over the sacred footprints of the Apollo astronauts, and the American government couldn't do anything about it. So yeah, that's a concern. It's a Wild West. If you want to, I suppose the benign view is there's so much resource out there that would we really be fighting over it? Because it's hard to get there. It's not going to be a ton of people doing it. It's not going to be like the gold rush out west where people were literally fighting each other over each particular claim. There's a lot of space is big. It's hard to get to. So maybe conflict will not arise initially, but it's there in principle always when you have this situation where anyone can claim ownership, and where the value of the resource is in principle. If you're the first person to harness a near-Earth asteroid with a couple of $1 trillion worth of rare earths and a couple of $1 trillion worth of precious metals, that's something worth fighting over.
Apparently, fighting over is probably the good word. What about, you've also, I know you've talked about one of the things that's, obviously a big inhibitor to us realizing some of our deeper space goals is just the cost of getting to orbit. And that really hasn't changed that much. And then you also talk about, once you get up into orbit, low Earth orbit, moving through the solar system isn't quite as difficult or costly. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I thought that was pretty interesting.
Sure. I mean, the beast is getting out of Earth's gravity. So the roughly half, I think it's maybe more, maybe 50% 90% of the energy cost of getting to the Martian surface is to getting into Earth orbit. So you're halfway there in energy cost to get to Earth orbit. And so a lot of the visions of how we function when we do start living in space involve setting up substantial infrastructure in Earth orbit. That's a good place to assemble things, pristine vacuum environment, using 3D printers and robots to build things. And so your big lift is to get to Earth orbit. Once you get a space elevator, even that becomes easy and cheap, but that's ways off. So yes, Earth orbit is a very important staging point. And of course, the NASA plan, it looks at cislunar orbit too. And so the moon that's another reason why the moon is a little more interesting than it would seem to most people who think it's rather boring to go back to a place after 50 years and there's nothing much there. It's sterile and not any place that seems reasonable to live, but it is a very good, with its much weaker gravity, and it's also a very pristine place to build things and test things. It's a good staging post for the rest of the solar system, if that's your long-term vision. So I think those all make sense. And I think people like, Musk with his Starship is trying to change the paradigm of how we move through the solar system. And it's economies of scale too. None of these efforts yet have approached any kind of economy of scale. They're still experimenting with technologies. They've had many successful launches. I think Falcon 9's had 110 successful launches. So that's definitely a good track record. But you are not going to generate that economic activity and that level of revenue that will sustain it long term until you really scale up the enterprise. So it's a bit of a catch-22. How do you get there? And the answer is you sink a lot of money into it, as they're doing.
What about some of the other, a lot of the more grandiose visions of space and Mars have, talked about things like terraforming, and you also, it's not getting us to Mars, but you've talked a little bit about the space elevator and things of that nature. I mean, how in your perception, how realistic are things like a space elevator, or those questions of terraforming Mars as an option?
Sure. I mean, I would put those two things in very different categories. I mean, terraforming Mars is certainly possible in principle. I mean, the technology and the way to do it in several stages is fairly clear. You just have to heat up a Martian surface in sufficiency to release enough carbon dioxide to kick off a mild greenhouse effect. And then, of course, you liberate some liquids, and then you can start to generate a biosphere slowly in stages. But it's incredibly expensive. It's cost an incredible amount of energy and resource to do it. So it's one of those things that is in principle possible, and NASA's had plans of how to do it for decades, but nobody imagines it's going to happen anytime soon, where that really means this century, I would say. Space elevators in a different category, because we have the technology pretty much now to do a space elevator on the moon, which would facilitate this, staging post. Once you can build things on the moon and then put them into a zero gravity environment, essentially for free with a space elevator, then the solar system is your oyster. So the tensile strength of a space elevator material is close to existing now for the moon with its 1/6 gravity. And there's a ton of engineering problems that go with that. But the engineers are wonderful in this arena. They just don't get deterred by engineering issues. They just view them as problems to solve. And it's a big long list of problems, but they don't think there's any obstacle. On the Earth, we couldn't do it now, and maybe we don't know when we'll be able to do it, but it's certainly possible, again, in principle, that we're not way away from being able to do a space elevator on the Earth, and these will be transformational technologies in terms of liberating the space, the future of space activity.
When you talk about a space elevator, I mean, what are we talking about in terms of actually the altitude, or that we would be talking about with something like a technology like that?
I mean, people sort of minimize, and if they have a mental image of a space elevator, they actually minimize the scope of it, because it is like an Indian rope trick, something hanging there in the air, but it actually extends a quarter of the way to the moon. So it's not just going up to the altitude of Earth orbit. To get this a counterbalance between the weight of the elevator material and the centrifugal force, you actually have to extend it with a counterweight to, like I said, a quarter of the distance all the way to the moon. So it's an enormous amount of material involved in making this. And then, of course, you have solar powered lifters that are moving up and down, and that's why it's free to get into orbit using this. So you have to construct this, and it's a fantastic construction activity to be able to do it, and to have the purity of material in the elevator itself, that because any imperfections, as anyone sort of material scientist knows, if you have crystals and lattices and so on, imperfections can weaken a material dramatically, even modest imperfections. So the purity of the material, some carbon nanotube composite, some future version of that, is not really attainable yet on the Earth. So there are plenty of issues standing in the way of it. But it's very seductive, because for people who want to do an industrial activity in space, or facilitate the industrialization of space and spreading beyond the Earth, it is the game changer.
We're just about out of time for this flash class, but just a couple of other things. Somebody, Tiffany Vora, who's one of our collaborators, asked a question about: do you have any thoughts back to the issue of kind of contentious nature of humans, ways that we can get other countries to for a better collaboration on these kinds of things?
Sure, I think it will benefit the space activity, and it's not just done by a handful of superpowers. And of course, if we look around, the space club has got bigger. I mean, India's done some pretty amazing things in space the last couple of years.
Right.
Brazil is active. Japan always has been active. So there's a group of, if we set aside the superpower rivalries with Russia and China, there's a group of about 7 or 8 countries that have been doing work in space and are natural collaborators, and having that diversity of participation is really important, and the diversity culturally, or diversity of backgrounds, languages, religions. It's going to be a much more plausible, sustainable thing if we're knitted together in that way off Earth. The commonality cannot just be people who are adventurous and want to be beyond the planet, or want to get away from their troubles on Earth.
Right.
It would be a more positive vision if we did project sort of international cooperation and multicultural alliances off Earth. That would be a positive thing that we could do.
Final question. Somebody asked, how important, I guess, the idea of, how important is it that we, the importance of getting humans in space as quickly as possible? What are the benefits of that from a scientific standpoint, as opposed to perhaps being more patient? And there's, this dichotomy. It's like, some people say, well, it's not time yet. Others are making noises about going for, very quickly within the next, 5 to 10 years.
I'm sort of agnostic in that score. I don't think there's any great impatience. The people who want to do it badly and are funding the activity, they're impatient. They want it to happen while they're still alive. And then, the backdrop issue that we haven't talked about is, of course, most scientists and engineers are very well aware of how much better robots do in space than humans. And now robots with AI capabilities, approaching sentience, if not reaching that, are extraordinarily capable. So and it does beg the fundamental question: why should it be us? Why does it have to be us? And that almost returns us to where we started, because I think it's an itch that has to be scratched for humans to want to explore and venture and sometimes live in these alien environments. And so it will happen. There's no urgency, though, right? There's nothing that will happen if it takes 20 years instead of 5 years.
Chris, thank you so much. We're out of time. This has been really interesting, and I appreciate your time. Again, I encourage everybody to go back and dig into some of his other material that he's done. It's really, really fascinating. And again, thank you to all of our sponsors: Space 629, Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, National Stem Cell Foundation, Children's Center, Space Tango, the START program, the Solar System Virtual Institute at NASA, Higher Orbits Media Collaboratory, and 22 Solutions. Thank all of you. And this is recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel within a week or so. So if you missed all of it or some of your colleagues would like to see it, it will be available there. So thank you all so much. And Chris, thank you again.
Okay, thanks, Chris, for inviting me in. I'm glad to have all of you with me.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for Humanity in Deep Space. You can find all of our videos, as well as other curated content, at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space.